everybody, Edwin the Magic Engineer here. How's it going? So what I wanted to do with you guys right now is this is my favorite old school deck, and I wanted to go over the deck tech, basically kind of talk about how I built it, what I look at when I'm building a deck, and what I try to avoid, the kind of things I think about to kind of walk you guys through the process. So to kind of quickly show you the end result, this is a stack of cards I ended up pulling out of the deck. This is the sideboard as it currently exists for the deck, and I'll go over all these. And this is the actual deck as it currently exists, and it's basically Curd Apes, Juggernauts, Serendibs, Urnams, Berserks, Unstable Mutations, Bolts, then a lot of control cards like Chaos Orb, Discs, and did they get put in a different spot? Did I ever go through the bolts? Yeah, the bolts are there. And then a bunch of draw, like the Wheel, Walk, and Brain Geyser, Time Twister, Ancestral. Then a solid mana base of any color. There's blue-green, there's red-green, red-blue. Then some additional creatures that can't be countered. Then some draw, situationally, and then just some speed added to it. That's effectively what the deck actually is, but what I want to really focus in on is kind of the theory that I was going on when I built the deck, because I think that's the biggest learning thing. So to start off with, what I knew I wanted to do was make a really fast deck, and actually there was one main card I wanted to focus the deck around. It was this. When Old School opened up, the rules basically said you could have 4 Berserks, and I knew that that was going to be a big deal because this for the longest time was a restricted card, and the real reason it's restricted is because it's a multiplier. It's not an addition, it's a multiplier. When you giant growth something, you add 3, but when you Berserk a card, you multiply you times 2 the actual attack damage. So if you have like 3 damage coming in and then you go times 2, that's 6, 12, 24, 48, right? I mean, you can see how much impact that basically has. So I knew when I saw the rules for Old School that you can have 4 of these. I looked at it and said, I want to build a deck that I've never been allowed to build before. So what can I build that's going to be good for that? So that was green, so obviously I knew Urnams would have to be a part of it. And, but I knew I was going to need to splash some color in because green doesn't have good removal and it doesn't have very good draw. So there was a big question on like, am I going to add blue to the deck or am I going to add red for the deck? If I add blue, I can add draw. If I add red, then I can add a lot of good control and a lot of good fiery burn. And at the end of the day, I eventually decided to like just play the waters and see could I do both of them. Now the reason why there was 4 Curd Apes and 4 Serendibs, but then the higher cost creatures, the 4-drops, there's only 3 and 3, is because that's all mana curve. A deck like this has to come out really, really fast, and you have to kill the other guy before he can react. Under that theory, if you have a bunch of high cost creatures, that's not going to work. It has to come out fast. So the Curd Apes fit perfectly, and the Serendibs fit perfectly. They were really great. The next creatures were a little bit more of a question, which was interesting because the Urnam already started with green, which matched something I wanted to build the deck around. So I've played this format, not in Old School format, but back in the day I used to play a deck like this for Legacy, but I was never allowed to do 4 of these. And so I'd played with creatures and I already knew that this was a winning creature combination, so I landed on this. Now the next thing I added in is I thought, well, if I'm going to have those, I know I'm going to have lots of speedy green, so I could also add some giant growths. And then I remembered that unstable mutations are available in this format, and they are just fantastic. So I threw in the unstable mutations also. Now the problem is, though, this was so many cards that added to the damage that could be dealt by any one of these creatures. If there was ever a time where like you're attacking with a Curd Ape and then you have maybe an Unstables on him and then you Berserk and Giant Growth and you put all these effects on the stack, if they plowed him in response and the plow hits before like the instance resolve, you lose all these cards and it became really ineffective. So I knew I couldn't do too many creature pumpers. It was just too many card slots devoted. And honestly, between the unstables and the giant growths, I prefer the unstables, because the unstables, they stick around and they end up being a lot more damage. And there's also times where you put something on the table and your opponent's tapped out and you need it not to die, so you unstable it immediately, and then his next turn he can't lightning bolt to kill it. It gives it some protection. And also the unstable is going to hit for 3 more, then 2 more, then 1 more, and eventually it'll kill the creature, but that's a lot of damage for 1 blue. So I like the unstables a lot more. So I knew that I was headed towards this kind of setup for very fast, speedy creatures. But in a format that a lot of other decks are possible, you know that you need lots of good control, right? So the next question was going to be, what's going to be there for the control slot? So let me get down to those cards. Now notice I'm going to talk about mana last. Mana is always the last decision when I'm designing a deck. And that's actually a really important aspect, that mana is always last. So I knew I had a good creature base, and I knew I had a good amount of speedy damage that could add up really fast. But how am I going to respond to my opponents? Well, being green, I had the ability to put tranquilities in, but they only hit enchantments. I needed to be able to hit artifacts and enchantments that were a real threat. So after some time, I eventually landed on the Nevinral's disc as being my way of dealing with those. But also, I was actually playing some games one-on-one with Daniel Chang over the Skype group, and we started talking about how much of a threat Blood Moon was, and the two of us together started discussing what a good answer this would be to Blood Moon. And because if somebody Blood Moons all my lands and I can't get any mana, well, I can at least have something to deal with this. So this also was a solid answer for that. Now, Chaos Orb, that's just an auto add. In any old school deck, you add a Chaos Orb because it's one of the best answers that there is in the entire old school format. So it's just an auto add. That's a no-brainer. Now, the question of removal was a big one. I started initially like this, with 4 bolts and 4 chain lightnings. And I quickly realized that, they just didn't do enough sustained damage. I could remove creatures off the table, but I ended up constantly doing this thing where I was just having to answer what my opponent was doing, and I couldn't push them back on their heels and get them on defense too easily. Because the creatures became less aggressive because I pulled cards out to make slots for all of this. And of course the chains are nice, but they're not instant speed. So I eventually pulled the chains back out and decided that this was enough removal main deck to have the deck actually work. So that's the removal aspect main deck. The speed question, I'll talk about this actually when I get to mana. In fact, I'm going to put this in the mana pile because that's really where it belongs. Regrowth is a decision that I come to every once in a while. Maybe a regrowth would be really good because there's a lot of powerful stuff there, and you pull back the right card, and that might win the game. And so this one still is on the fence. It's not main deck at the moment, but it's such a good card it might end up back in the main deck. Sylvan Library. This card I ended up pulling because it wasn't fast enough effectively. When I looked at the other draw options that I had on the table, what I had was, Ancestral, I don't even need to explain that, and Wheel of Fortune and Time Twister. These are all just super efficient draw spells. And remember, like with these two, you definitely give cards to your opponents as well, but if my deck did its job, it was so aggressive, I pushed my opponent back on defense really fast, and they didn't have a good chance to respond. And so I would be able to make use of the cards drawn much faster. And actually, let's see if I can get this changing colors. I was telling some people about this thing and how cool it is. There we go, look at that. I got this for my birthday from my wife who's right over there. It's really awesome. Thank you, hon. So anyways, so these card draws are super efficient. The Brain Geyser is a bit of a question because you need a lot of mana to make it work. So I had to really play test this one to see if it works, and of course it does. And the Time Walk, I mean, this has just ended so many games, it's ridiculous. If you play this once you've got a couple creatures out, even with like 2 creatures, you smash them pretty hard and then you walk, oftentimes that just ends the game. So that was an auto include. all of these draw spells were just faster than the Sylvan library, and since this didn't hit the speed theme, it was better in a slower played out control deck, it eventually came back out. Now in terms of the mana base, once I've decided the deck, next thing I always do when I'm doing deck design is I lay out all my colors and I try to see what that balance is basically like. Because I need to make a decision based on what colors have to be there to support. So those are all blues, greens, reds. And so I ended up looking at it and saying, you know what? It's actually fairly balanced. I mean, I'm mostly blue, yes. But the blue, a lot of it I have, doesn't have to be out on turn 1. And the red, a lot of it, especially the apes, has got to be available on turn 1. Oh, I just made my thing change. There we go. Let's stick with green. So the red has to be available very early on, and the green doesn't have to be as available as fast. So if any of the colors I could throttle back on a bit, it would probably honestly be green, because the Berserks are a little bit more late game, because you have to already have a creature to Berserk it. And the Urnams are 4-drops, so they're not necessarily fast. So these are the colors that need to be out the earliest, right? So once I knew that was my mana balance, I started playing around with the land adjusters. And let's take all those out for a second. So the first thing I started with was just doing like a mix of the colors of dual lands that I knew I would need for the actual cards that are in the deck. And the question that I ask myself is, do I ever have a point where, like, if I don't draw like that color, then I'm stuck? Or am I constantly having a surplus of colors and I can throttle back and put more into basic lands? Because remember, Blood Moon is a major threat for if I'm doing a land base like this. So after a lot of play testing, I've come to discover that with the discs and other red spells and other colorless control that's in the deck, I can survive a Blood Moon on game 1, and then I can board against it later on. So I can go ahead and make sure my play is more consistent. So I lean deeper into multicolor lands instead of basic lands. And to make sure that was even the case, I added some cities to make sure I can get the colors that I need. And so now colors is much less of a problem. Because remember, the whole strategy with an aggressive deck like this is, with all these creatures and stuff, turn 1, 2, and 3 is super important. You have to push the opponent on defense or the deck isn't working right. So the mana base had to allow for that speed to actually happen. Now to talk about the artifacts that are in there for speed, of course the colors that you actually need are the on colors the most, and of course the Lotus. So you need the on colors the most. And so the ones, if any, that would get pulled would be the off color. But in the play testing, since I have so many creatures and other things that require colorless, like the Urnams take colorless, the Serendibs take colorless, the Juggernauts take colorless, the draw spells take colorless, and like even the control cards take colorless, it turned out that it was okay to have off-color speed in there, so they all got included. Fast Bond was in the deck early on, but it put me down a card. Because in order for Fast Bond to be effective, you have to have something to put the Fast Bond into play, and then you can play your other lands, but it doesn't produce mana unto itself. So in a situation like this, if I draw this, I cannot cast a Serendib with that, right? However, if I cast this, I can play a Serendib with it. So the Fast Bond adds speed, but you have to couple it with card draw for it to be effective. And so a deck like this that doesn't have a ton of draw runs out of draw. So that's why the Fast Bond basically came out. So, so the speed cards were all there. So the next section was, I knew that I needed to have a surplus of creatures, and there would be good control cards like Wrath of God is out there, Pestilence is out there, the Abyss is out there. So I needed to have things that can survive that, especially, balance too. So the factories I knew had to be in the deck, and how many factories was a question. So like this could have been a 4th factory, right? Which would have strengthened my ability to have creatures even with them having removal. The thing is that why I stuck with the library is, even though this is an aggressive deck and it just empties its hand really fast, with the Library of Alexandria, if you get this on early game or there's ever a point where you time twister or your opponent does, the point is when you can activate this, this card single-handedly will win you a game because the card advantage it gives is just too powerful not to include. So sometimes it does end up being this late game card that you draw. Your hand's already down to 2 cards and it gives you nothing other than a colorless mana. That happens. But then other times it just flat out wins the game for you. So that's good enough to be an include. So that's how the deck mostly got built. But after playtesting, I had to decide what my main threats actually were, and that's where the sideboard comes in. Now, as I said, Blood Moon is a major threat, and also control decks can be a major threat. So putting 2 more discs in the sideboard, that gives me 4 discs in the deck after I sideboard if I decide that that's something I need, and that gives me a lot of abilities to control it, especially considering my opponent might blow up one of the discs or counter it on the way out, because it comes into play and you got to just sit there on your thumbs and just pray they don't kill it until it untaps and you can actually use it. So that made disking to control a little bit more consistent. Another thing was counter wars. When you get into a counter war, it comes down to card advantage, right? And so all of these come in. A perfect example is like, let's say I'm going to play like Brian Weissman's The Deck, right? And this ratio of this deck against the deck is actually pretty good. I'd say I at least win half of the games most of the time, which is good against the deck that's the gold standard of the format. But what I'll do is I will actually take out all of the acceleration, like the Berserks and the Unstables will all come out, because what the deck does is the deck wins by card advantage. And so you drop these on a creature and then the deck plows the creature or disenchants it if it's a Juggernaut or a Factory, and then you lose multiple cards. So with the deck, since the game the deck plays is very defensive and they try to go card for card, you tend to do better when you can go card for card. And when I put in counter magic, I tend to do a lot better against them. So the creature acceleration speed comes out and you board these in. But an interesting thing is a lot of opponents, they don't know that I boarded this out. All that they know is I took cards out of the deck, right? So they still play very reserved because they're fearing like suddenly running into the face of Berserks, right? They don't know if they're going to hit that. But the fact is that they don't. So the first game, I'll hit them so hard, I'll put them on defense, and they'll fear that kind of attack. And that's part of the strategy. So anyways, the counter magic is there. And it's also there for other decks that I haven't anticipated, because people come up with new stuff all the time in Old School. You don't really know what they're going to do. And so if you have some good generic counter magic, you're able to do something about it, right? And these are just there because they're just so efficient. If I can do these instead of these, of course I will. But a lot of times, like, you can't. So the energy fluxes are an interesting question. There's a lot of decks out there that play a plethora of artifacts. Now, yes, my deck does have artifacts. I've got the artifact mana, and I've got the Juggernauts, and I've got the Nevinral's discs. So yes, that's all there. But the thing is, I don't have to play all those. I can hold those in my hand. And if I play against a deck that's artifact dependent, I can drop these on the table and I can choke them so badly that I can keep playing because I have a lot of a lot of very aggressive strategies. So I can still continue playing even though I make the environment harsh on both of us. It's still more harsh on them. So Energy Flux is just amazing, and that's been an awesome auto-include. This last one, or one of the last two, I should say, the Strip Mine possibly should have been in the main deck. Some people would state that. I'm not going to argue that too much. It's got a lot of validity, because if somebody plays a Library of Alexandria against me and I can't respond, I'll lose games because of it. And if I don't have my Strip Mine main deck, I don't have that shot. That's true. And so this might someday go back in main deck. I've been playing it in the sideboard, and so far that's worked out okay. It is a question whether or not it deserves to go back in main deck, kind of like the Regrowth coming back in. The Mirror Universe is interesting because there are times where a control matchup can really slow us down, or they will mirror me, or maybe my my attacks were ineffective, and in the past, you used to be able to kill people using a mirror universe and something that does damage to you. Now that doesn't work anymore, right? Because you can't do a damage to yourself so you're at 0 and then trade life like during your upkeep. That trick doesn't work. But I still actually can take myself down to very low life and then trade with them and then finish off with a bolt. That's not a super hard thing to do. And so the mirror has just been, it's been really good against other aggressive decks. Sometimes if I go against another deck that's very aggressive, like goblins or something, maybe I'll just hold back and I'll only put enough creatures on the board, like an Urnam, that makes them have to empty their hand against me. And then once their hand is empty, drop a mirror, activate the mirror, and then now that damage they did to me is theirs. And my hand was empty because I held it, and I empty my hand now on them, and they can't stop that. So anyways, that's effectively the deck. And with this deck, I did really well at GP Vegas, actually. I was going undefeated on Sunday, and I nearly went undefeated on Saturday when I played it. I only actually, on Saturday, the only game that I technically got a loss to was against Randy Bueller, and I'll put an image up here on the screen. What happened was I actually, I didn't make it to the table in time, and it was like 10 minutes late, so they just gave me a loss for that match, but Randy was pretty awesome, and he let me actually play. And so we actually got to play, and all the other games I went undefeated the rest of the time on Saturday, and I ended up getting 5th overall because of that one first loss. But when I played Randy, the neat moment was I had lands and I had no creatures, but I had a Time Walk and a Curd Ape in my hand, and I played the Curd Ape and I Time Walked, and then I followed that up with I attacked with him, and then I had an Unstable Mutation that I'd played on him, and then I Berserked him twice, and that added up to 20 damage. And it was so funny that Randy Bueller took out his phone and he was sitting there taking a picture of it just because he thought it was a funny situation. And I was laughing at first, and then I was like, hey, wait a minute. I just smashed Randy Bueller for 20 points and he's taking a picture of it. I should be taking a picture of it. So I took out my phone and took a picture, and that's this photo that you can see on the screen now. So anyways, that's this deck, and maybe that gives you a little bit of insight into kind of what I'm looking at when I'm building a deck. Maybe there's actually one more thing I want to say about it. You might notice that there isn't like a lot of like enchantments in this deck that I'll play, and there isn't a ton of artifacts. There's a theory I think that's really worth saying when I build a deck. Like a different deck I've got has no artifacts whatsoever. It's an unpowered red white deck, and what's good about that is since there's no artifacts, when your opponent plays things like, their disenchants or their shatters, something meant to destroy artifacts, when you have none of them in the deck, that leaves them with dead cards. And that can be a really powerful thing if you can just completely ignore one thing and then go for one strategy really hard. That can be an effective win. That's kind of what this deck does. It goes straight for offense and big damage really early, but then late game it does actually have some ability to stay in it with the card draw and the disc to like recover the environment and such. So anyways, I just wanted to mention that. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and let me know what you think of the video. Put some comments down below if you want, and if you want to see more 93, 94 deck discussions and kind of hear kind of what the thought process is for building them, just let me know. Bye everybody.